Hello, my name is Mary Ollie, and I'm here to talk to you about the Idaho Science Standards. First of all, a little bit about me. I've taught science for a long time. I've taught all of the disciplines in middle school and in high school. I have worked on state standards starting back in the 1990s. I did not work on this set of science standards, however. I have worked on standards implementation at the district level as a science curriculum coordinator. What I'd like to talk to you about today is the contentious nature of the current Idaho standards adoption. I think it is as it is because this is a story that began with a careless use of words. The careless use of words was spread through some misleading news articles, which engaged a lot of good people who had very good intentions to comment on what they thought were standards, but they weren't. So the comments are managed and they're misleading us, and that leads us to two big concerns about what's been going on. One of the concerns is the use of words, the use of the word standard and what it means. The second is when the word standards is used very loosely, we have a concern called boundaries, and this refers to the boundaries between the different levels of government. So with that said, we have to think about how all of this will end. And we want this to end positively. All of us want to be part of the solution instead of continuing this problem. So let me begin with, first of all, the news. When the legislature met in January, they reviewed administrative rules. And one of these administrative rules were the Idaho Science Standards. The problem was the document did not include just standards. And I think our legislators understood some of that. They voted to remove some references, and the media reported it as removing references to standards. This information was spread, deleting the standards, and it spread from one media outlet to the other. Removing references to standards, deleting climate change from standards, stripping climate change from standards. The problem was we didn't strip things from standards, except in one instance. What the legislators did was they, instead of rejecting 5 science standards, they actually rejected 4 pieces of content. And this was never made clear to anyone. As a result, public meetings were held because people were still under the misconception that the Idaho legislature had either rejected some standards or they were censoring teachers. The hearings were held without any clarification of what actually went on, and of course the comments were overwhelmingly in favor of the standards the lawmakers rejected, except these weren't standards. So we need to look at something extremely important to this discussion, and that is that words have meaning. A standard has a very specific and precise meaning. It's not content and it's not curriculum. Teachers who work with standards at state levels need to understand this. So what is a standard? Well, we have to go to some common definitions, and since Idaho legislates standards, it's extremely important all of us know exactly what a standard is. It's what students should know and do. Know and do. It's not content, it's not curriculum, it's not instruction. Furthermore, we need to talk about boundaries. Idaho Code has the duties of the legislature and 2 agencies, the State Department of Education and the State Board of Education, in setting minimum state standards. These have the force of law. However, it's up to the local governments, that is the local Board of Trustees, working with the teachers and the patrons, to establish local standards and curriculum. We can look at another definition that's accepted, and again you see the repetition, know and be able to do. So standards are very specific. It's what students should know and be able to do. Sometimes standards are called performance expectations, but again they are not the content, not the curriculum, not the instruction. Content, curriculum, instruction is local. Setting the minimum standards is a state duty. I'm going to refer a bit to the next generation science standards because Idaho essentially adopted the next generation science standards. I want you to know that personally I think they are the standards are well written. We do need to understand that these standards do not apply to high school students in advanced classes. They were never intended to. These performance expectations, which are the standards, outline in Idaho the minimum of what students should know and do. So the next generation science standards upon which Idaho's are based has the following organization. At the top, we have the performance expectation, what students should know and should do. Then, how do they get there? Well, we need some resources to help students. Maybe we can get them excited about a science and engineering practice. Have them tell us what the big ideas are of what they learned. Some cross-cutting concepts, important skills that tie things together. So again, the performance expectations are the standard. That's it. The other three pieces are foundational. So standards, again, very specific. The language of standards is words like analyze, evaluate, design. These are doing verbs. The support for designing the curriculum and instruction, this is local. This is what the districts, the science departments, and the teachers do. Resources for that are the other three things you see on the screen. The science and engineering practices, for example, have been called applications for as long as I've been teaching. The disciplinary core ideas, these are big ideas. In fact, most teachers will ask the students at the end of a lesson or at the end of a unit to summarize what they learned. This is how it should come about. It should never be legislated. The cross-cutting concepts, these are big skills across all sciences. Students who have the ability to see patterns or analyze patterns, to identify cause and effect, to appreciate scale from the microscopic to the macroscopic. This goes across all sciences, and it's so important to have these. So let's look at what Idaho did. Well, Idaho, in their standards document, adopted the performance expectations. Those are the standards. So far, so good. However, in the standards document, which is administrative code, Idaho put in something else, and that was supporting content. Not a good idea to legislate this, and I'll tell you why in a bit. Idaho did leave out the applications, and Idaho did leave out the cross-cutting concepts. And that's fine, because these three things should be left to the local levels of government, never ever legislated. So when we compare the next generation science standards versus Idaho, we see the next generation science standards have three areas that are resources that teachers and curriculum developers can use. These should never be legislated because how we use them may depend on the ages, interests, and ability of our students. The core ideas, for example, may change. In fact, science has a history of changing ideas. We know what happened to Galileo when he tried to change some ideas. He went in front of the Inquisition. Many of us remember when margarine was a health food. Okay, ideas change. In Idaho, the science and engineering practices and cross-cutting concepts were not included in the standards document, and that's a good thing. However, the disciplinary core ideas were under the name of supporting content, and that is a bad thing in my opinion. So let's look at how the next generation science standards developers looked at things. Well, once again, we're going to repeat some things. The performance expectations or standards are statements of what students should know and be able to do. The writing team is neutral on this issue, so let me read the second sentence here. Some states consider these performance expectations alone to be the standards. Idaho is one of those states because Idaho has local control. So the performance expectations alone can be adopted by the legislature when they adopt administrative rule. Everything else should be local, otherwise we're breaching boundaries. So if we look at the next generation science standards, if you search, you're going to find some standards. And I'm going to tell you, I do like the way the standards are worded because they really hone in on critical thinking. Notice, develop and use a model, analyze and interpret, ask questions, evaluate. these are good. These introduce us to how students should think as scientists. But again, remember, these are not intended for advanced high school classes. Science is one way of knowing, and the next generation science standards do a good job of honing in on that. The language, the way the performance expectations are worded, is pretty open-ended. And that's important because science does have a degree of uncertainty. Information changes, ideas change as we find new evidence, and the performance expectations as they're worded are very good at introducing students to how scientists work. They're using those doing verbs. If we were to look at putting the package together, this is what you would see if you went to the Next Generation Science Standards website. You would see the performance expectation at the top. This is the standard. So the students who can demonstrate understanding can. In this case, they can ask questions. Now, this is what they should be able to do after they've completed the classroom activities. So what are some of those classroom activities? Well, down at the bottom here, teacher might have the students come up with some applications. The teacher, after the kids have finished the lesson, they may have to write in their science journals what they learn. That's where the big ideas come from. They might be asked to practice their abilities to see patterns, or in this case, the big idea here, the cross-cutting concept, is stability and change. But what I want you to do is look at the middle one, disciplinary core ideas. You notice how that wording is very different from the standard that is up at the top. The verb in the standard up at top says ask questions to clarify evidence. We go to the disciplinary core idea and it's a narrative. My concern is that the Idaho Science Standards have left these narratives in and they're about to be legislated. That's very serious. So let's look at Idaho content standards and see what Idaho content standards do. We have all of the areas that are accessible to us online. I chose to look at the ELA, English Language Arts, and the math. And I particularly wanted to look at formatting because I saw how the Next Generation Science Standards were set up with just the standard and then underneath the three areas that can support the development and implementation of the standards. Now remember, Idaho legislates standards, so formatting is important. Idaho is doing a review of standards simply because we wanted to emphasize critical thinking, less memorization, more doing. In other words, we want kids to exercise the muscle between their ears. So, looking at the English Language Arts standards, I chose a middle school section, and as we look, we see cite, we see compare and contrast, we see analyze. So we're seeing a lot of doing verbs. Okay, that's the wording. That's part of the format. The other part of the format is that these are standards and we're not seeing narratives, we're not seeing content. Okay? Content does not play a part in the standards. Content is there to support that. Let's look at the math standards. Use, interpret, find, use. Again, we are seeing doing verbs and we're not seeing statements of content. So if we look at science and social studies, again, we're going to hone in on the standards. We're going to look at the formatting. And when we look at the Idaho Science Standards, they're different. We'll see at the top of this page is a blue bar that says Performance Standards. And we see again those doing verbs, construct, analyze, and interpret. Okay, so far so good. We go down to the bottom of the page and we see a green bar that says Supporting Content. Now remember, the ELA, English Language Arts, and Math standards did not have supporting content in it. You'll notice something in red. This is the one and only standard the legislature rejected. One. Continuing on, now you're seeing more red lines, and these red lines are under supporting content. These are narratives. Remember, the ELA and Math standards do not contain these. Under the blue bar, these are standards. Look at the language again. Use. Okay. Here's another red bar, and another red bar, and another red bar. Those are pieces of supporting content the legislature rejected, and for good reason. Well, let's make sure that we're on the right track here. So let's look at social studies. And again, explain, analyze. Again, we're seeing doing verbs in our standards. We are not seeing supporting content. So that leaves me to ask everyone, why would Idaho Science Standards include supporting content? There's a real problem with including supporting content because, as I said earlier, content can change. And also, if we simply lay the content out there, then we're not asking the kids to critically think and put information together. So because the term standards was misused or loosely used, public response to the news that the legislature had eliminated 5 of the standards was overwhelming. There were over 1,100 pages of comment, and I read them. They are available to people who would like to read them. When I read them, I could see it demonstrated the effect of misusing words because people thought the content was the standards were being left out. This was, of course, reinforced by misleading media reports that I showed you earlier. And even in speaking with people, their misunderstandings were evident. I was able to talk to people at the hearings, and everyone that I talked to was very concerned that the Idaho legislature left out important standards, and another group, maybe a little bit smaller but pretty significant, was convinced the Idaho legislature was censoring teachers. The written reports showed a huge number of form letters all on the same thing, but here's a review. The theme was, people were concerned we are removing standards. We are removing standards. We're censoring teachers. Please allow our teachers to teach. And then a huge number of form letters. Again, confusing standards with content. Leave the sections, keep the standards. The problem is the legislature removed, for the most part, content, and that's good. And the reason it's good is that we have some governmental boundaries to be aware of. The legislature has its duties. The agencies, the State Board of Education and the State Department of Education, have a duty. Together, they define the minimum, what students should know and do, the standards, and these have the force of law. The local school boards, on the other hand, are to adopt curriculum, and curriculum comes when the teachers, working through their school's organization and involving the community, comes up with how to implement these standards, and they are free to go beyond the standards. So the boundaries begin with the Idaho Constitution. The legislature has certain duties, and it has certain things they can't do. One of the things they cannot do is take on the duties of local school boards. More information is found in Idaho statutes. And again, though, because we were not careful with how the word standard was used, we have some problems with the Idaho standards. The misleading news, the good intentions, the managed comments all led us to totally missing the target of good science education. Right now we are distracted by fighting over the meaning of words that belong in content. And in doing so, we are eroding the boundaries of government. Take the content out. If we don't take the content out, what's going to happen is the content will be legislated, and when content is legislated, content takes on the flavor of the last election. It becomes politicized. So if the election results turn left, the content turns left. If it turns right, the content turns right. We don't want that. We want students to be able to know and do things, and in order to get there, we have to use the standard word precisely. I've gone through how what standards are and what they are not. I've revealed what misleading news, the result of that. What our legislature did not do. Our legislature did not reject 5 standards, and it did not censor teachers. What the legislature should do, I think, is reject all of the content. Sadly, good people reacted. They were distracted, they're divided, we are fighting over content. And that I have two concerns about that. One is we still are not looking at what a standard is, and because we lack that definition, we are in danger of eroding the boundaries of government. And when we do that, we're going to see standards content legislated, and that's going to lead us down the road to problems with academic freedom and more arguments about facts, because facts and science can change. So what do we do? Now what? I would hope that you review some of the points I've made in this presentation, and you take that as an opportunity to speak with your legislators, because I think legislators want to do the right thing. They're not going to want to intrude on the boundaries of government, and I think they also need to understand that our other standards have one format. Science standards need to follow the formats of our other standards and leave out the content. Also take this as an opportunity to speak with your friends and family about this, because we all want to have a good education for our Idaho students. When we go off the rails like we have on the standards, we're not giving students a good education. We're simply fighting about politics. So thank you for listening. I hope you do take this information to heart and we all become part of the solution.